The courthouse square in Ripley, West Virginia sits quiet on a July morning. The kind of quiet that feels heavier than silence. American flags hang from the old street lamps, barely stirring in the thick summer air. The brick storefronts along Main Street cast long shadows across empty sidewalks. On the corner where Maple meets Court Street, a single folding chair leans against a lamppost, left over from something, waiting for something. A placeholder for a memory that used to fill this entire block. 30 years ago, on a morning like this, you couldn't find a parking spot within 3 blocks of this square. Families would arrive before dawn to claim their place along the parade route, spreading blankets on the courthouse lawn. Kids running between the legs of neighbors they'd known their whole lives. The 4th of July wasn't just a celebration here. It was the day Ripley remembered who it was. But when the factories closed and the jobs disappeared, this town faced a question that thousands of American communities have faced. A question with no easy answer. What happens when the economy that sustained a place vanishes, but the people refuse to let go of the traditions that defined them? Can a town survive on memory and determination alone? And if it does, what does survival really mean? This is the story of what Ripley lost and what its people refused to let go. Before we go deeper, I'd love to know, did you grow up in a small town? Drop a comment and let me know where you're joining from today. The first thing you notice about Ripley is how the hills hold it. Drive in from any direction, and the road descends into a valley where the town sits cradled between green ridges that seem to lean inward, as if listening. The Little Kanawha River winds along the western edge, visible in glimpses between buildings, its surface catching light differently depending on the season. Silver in winter, green-brown in summer when the trees overhead grow thick. Main Street runs straight through the center, a corridor of 2- and 3-story brick buildings with cornices and archways that speak to another century's ambitions. Some storefronts glow with interior lights, the insurance office, the pharmacy that's been there since 1947, the diner with its hand-painted sign. Others stand dark, their windows reflecting the street back at itself, glass holding memories of what once filled those spaces. The hardware store, the dress shop, the 5 and dime where children press their noses against displays of penny candy. The Jackson County Courthouse anchors the town's heart. A white columned structure set back from the street with a lawn that slopes gently toward the sidewalk. The building faces Main Street with a kind of patient dignity, as if it understands its role as witness to everything that has unfolded here. On weekday mornings, a handful of cars angle park along the curb. People walk slowly, stopping to talk in a way that suggests they're never truly in a hurry, that the conversation matters more than whatever errand brought them downtown. At dawn, the smell of coffee drifts from the diner's propped open door, mixing with the scent of damp pavement if it rained overnight, or with the dry, dusty warmth of summer mornings when humidity settles into the valley like a blanket. The sound of a truck engine echoes differently here than it would on open highway. The hills catch it, soften it, send it back. A screen door closing 2 blocks away carries clearly through the quiet. This is a place where rhythm matters more than speed, where the same families sit in the same church pews their grandparents occupied, where the woman behind the pharmacy counter knows what you're picking up before you reach the register, knows to ask about your mother's hip surgery or your son's deployment, where Friday night football games at the high school draw crowds that represent a significant fraction of the town's population. Not because Ripley produces championship teams, but because showing up is what people do. Walk through Ripley on a Tuesday afternoon, and you'll see men in work clothes standing outside the post office, talking with hands in pockets. You'll see an elderly woman moving slowly along the sidewalk with a cane, stopping to rest on the bench someone bolted to the brick wall outside the closed movie theater. You'll see the flag outside the Veterans Memorial moving slightly in whatever breeze manages to find its way down into the valley. The town feels both occupied and emptied, alive and elegiac. There's no pretending it's thriving in any economic sense. But there's also no mistaking that people remain, that life continues, that the place still means something to those who've chosen to stay or chosen to return. What Ripley represents, what it has always represented, is a particular kind of American identity built not on ambition or reinvention, but on continuity. On the idea that where you come from matters, that the people who knew your parents and grandparents form a web of recognition that holds you in place, gives you context, reminds you who you are when the world tries to tell you you're nobody. In towns like this, identity was never about what you owned or achieved. It was about showing up, about being present for the moments that marked time. The 4th of July parade, the Christmas lighting ceremony, the Memorial Day service at the cemetery on the hill. About knowing that when something happened to you, good or difficult, people would know, without being told, would appear with casseroles or offers of help or simply their presence. This is what Ripley has always been. Not a place of grand events or famous residents, but a place where the ordinary rhythms of life were honored, where the passage of seasons and generations created a sense of permanence that felt, for a very long time, unshakable. The question that haunts the quiet streets now is whether that sense of permanence can survive when the economic foundation crumbles, whether tradition and memory and stubborn love for a place can sustain a community when the practical reasons for staying have largely disappeared. Ripley sits in its valley, held by hills, and waits for its own answer. Ripley wasn't always waiting. There was a time when the town didn't need to justify its existence, when the question of survival never entered anyone's mind because survival was simply assumed. In the 1970s and into the 1980s, Ripley hummed with a particular kind of confidence, not loud or boastful, but steady. It was the confidence that came from work, from paychecks that arrived on schedule, from knowing that if you showed up and did your job, there would be another shift next week and the week after that. The valley that cradled Ripley also cradled industry. Just beyond town, where the ridges opened into wider bottomland, factories rose against the green hills, glass plants that glowed orange at night, chemical manufacturing facilities with towers and pipes that seemed impossibly complex. Suppliers tied to the coal operations that honeycomb the mountains of West Virginia. These weren't glamorous places. The work was hard, often hot, sometimes dangerous. But it was work that paid enough to raise a family, to buy a house, to send a kid to college if they wanted to go. It was work that gave a man or woman a way to say, I provide, I contribute, I belong. Hundreds of people from Ripley and the surrounding county made that drive every morning. Lunch pails on the seat beside them, thermoses filled with coffee still hot from home. They worked shifts that rotated, days, evenings, nights, so that Main Street never entirely emptied, so that there was always someone stopping by the hardware store at 10 in the morning or the diner at 2 in the afternoon. The rhythm of the town was tied to the rhythm of the factories, and both felt permanent, woven into the landscape as surely as the river and the hills. On Friday nights, Main Street stayed open late. The hardware store kept its lights on until 8, the dress shop until 7. Families came into town after dinner, not because they needed anything urgently, but because it was what you did. Men stood outside the barber shop talking about the week's work, about overtime, about who was hiring. Women browsed the fabric at the shop that had been there since the 1950s, touching bolts of cotton and polyester, planning dresses for church or curtains for the kitchen. Teenagers gathered at the soda fountain, quarters lined up on the counter for another Coke, another song on the jukebox. The street had a pulse then, a sense of abundance that wasn't about wealth, but about presence. People everywhere, voices layering over each other, car doors slamming, the smell of popcorn from the little stand outside the Five and Dime. But if you wanted to understand what Ripley was in those years, you didn't look at a Friday night in October. You looked at the 4th of July. The 4th of July in Ripley wasn't just a holiday. It was the day the town showed itself to itself. The day when everyone who had ever lived there or loved someone who did came back, came home, came together. Preparations started weeks in advance. The volunteer fire department organized the parade route. The American Legion ordered flags. Families called dibs on their spots along Main Street, the same spots their parents had claimed, the same corners where their children would stand on tiptoes to see over the crowd. The parade wasn't elaborate. High school band, veterans in uniform, tractors pulling floats decorated by church groups and civic organizations, fire trucks with lights flashing. But it didn't need to be. It was theirs. By mid-morning on the 4th, you couldn't find a parking spot within 3 blocks of the courthouse. Families spread blankets on the grass, coolers filled with sandwiches and sweet tea, children running between the trees in clothes already stained with popsicle juice and grass. The parade rolled down Main Street to cheers and applause, and when it ended, people didn't leave. They stayed. They visited. They stood in long lines at the food stands set up by the Lions Club and the Methodist Church, buying hot dogs and funnel cakes. Not because they were hungry, but because it was part of the ritual. Old men sat on benches and told the same stories they told every year. Mothers caught up with women they hadn't seen since last summer. Teenagers pretended not to care but showed up anyway, because everyone did. And then, as dusk settled over the valley and the air cooled just enough to feel like relief, the fireworks began. They launched them from the hill behind the courthouse, and the explosions echoed off the ridges, doubling and tripling the sound, so that it felt like the whole valley was celebrating. Families sat together on their blankets, faces turned upward, children nestled against parents, the smell of sulfur drifting down with the smoke. For those 20 minutes, Ripley felt like the center of the world. It wasn't nostalgia then. It was just life. It was the assumption that next year would look like this year. That the parade would roll and the fireworks would burst and the blankets would spread across the same grass. It was the belief, so deep it didn't need to be spoken, that Ripley would always be Ripley. That the factories would keep running. That the children growing up here would have the choice to stay or leave. But that the town itself would remain, solid and familiar, a place you could always come back to. No one knew they were living in the last good years. No one ever does. They just lived them, showing up for work, keeping the shops open late on Fridays, spreading blankets on the courthouse lawn every 4th of July, believing without question that this was how it would always be. The unraveling began so quietly that for a while people in Ripley told themselves it was temporary. A downturn, a rough patch. The kind of thing towns like this had weathered before. In 1997, the largest glass plant 15 miles outside town announced it was closing. Not downsizing. Closing. 340 jobs gone in a single administrative decision made in an office tower somewhere far away by people who had never set foot in Jackson County and never would. The plant had operated for 42 years. Fathers had worked there, then sons. Some families had 3 generations employed under the same roof, carrying the same lunch pails, parking in spaces they'd claimed through seniority and habit. The announcement came in October. By Christmas, the plant was dark. At first, people tried to be optimistic. Other factories were still running. Men talked about transferring, retraining, holding on until something else opened up. Unemployment checks bought time. Families tightened budgets, but kept routines intact, kept showing up at church and football games, kept believing this was survivable. But closures rarely come alone. Within 2 years, a chemical plant downsized by half. A parts supplier that serviced the coal industry shut its doors entirely. A trucking company that had hauled materials for decades relocated to Ohio. Each closure sent ripples through Ripley. Fewer paychecks, fewer customers, fewer reasons for the next business to stay open. By 2001, the hardware store on Main Street closed. The owner, a man named Carl Hensley, had run it for 33 years. He didn't close because he wanted to retire. He closed because nobody was buying tools anymore. Nobody was building additions or fixing up houses or starting projects. People were holding on, not improving. The day he locked the door for the last time, he sat in his truck in the alley behind the store and cried. The dress shop followed 6 months later. Then the furniture store. Then the little bakery that had made wedding cakes for 2 generations of Ripley brides. It wasn't dramatic. There were no protests, no news cameras. Just keys turning in locks, signs flipping to closed, windows going dark one by one, like lights being extinguished in a house where no one lives anymore. The families faced impossible choices. Stay in a town where work was disappearing, where savings were draining, where the future looked darker every month. Or leave. Pack up everything familiar. The house your grandfather built. The church where your children were baptized. The cemetery where your parents rested. And go somewhere else. Somewhere with jobs, maybe. But also somewhere you'd be a stranger. Somewhere nobody knew your name or your story or why any of it mattered. Some families left, young people especially. They graduated high school and didn't come back. Parents who had assumed their children would raise grandchildren nearby watched them settle in Columbus, in Charlotte, in places that offered futures Ripley could no longer promise. The town grew quieter. The high school enrollment dropped. Streets that had always held the sounds of children playing grew still. And the 4th of July parade began to shrink. It didn't disappear all at once. People still showed up, still brought their folding chairs and their flags. But each year there were fewer floats, fewer marchers, fewer families lining the route. The fire department still participated, and the veterans, and the high school band, though the band itself was half the size it had been a decade before. By 2005, the parade route had shortened. There simply weren't enough people to justify the full loop around downtown. The fireworks display grew smaller too. The budget wasn't there anymore, and fewer volunteers meant less capacity to organize. Some people stopped coming. Not because they didn't care, but because it hurt too much. Because watching the parade dwindle felt like watching the town itself fade, like bearing witness to a slow, inevitable ending. They were powerless to stop. The fear wasn't just economic. It was existential. If the factories were gone, and the jobs were gone, and the young people were leaving, what was Ripley? If the parade kept shrinking, if Main Street stayed dark, if the routines that had defined life here for generations finally collapsed under the weight of loss, what would be left? Would Ripley become one of those towns you pass on the highway and barely notice? A place that used to be something, but isn't anymore? A name on a map with nothing behind it but memory and emptiness? That was the question hanging over the courthouse square in those years. Not whether Ripley could return to what it had been. Everyone knew that was impossible. But whether it could remain anything at all. Whether a town could survive when its economy died. Whether tradition and memory and stubborn love were enough to hold a community together when every practical reason to stay was gone. Some people believed the answer was no, that Ripley was dying, and the kindest thing would be to let it go. but others refused to accept that. 3 people refused to let Ripley disappear without a fight. They didn't organize committees or launch campaigns. They simply decided, in their own quiet ways, that some things mattered more than money, and that a town's heartbeat could survive even when its economy flatlined. Margaret Winters ran Winters Fabric and Notions on Main Street, in the same storefront her mother Alice had opened in April of 1963. The shop occupied a narrow building with tall windows that caught morning light, illuminating bolts of cotton and wool stacked floor to ceiling along wooden shelves her father had built by hand. For 40 years, women had gathered here not just to buy fabric, but to talk about children, gardens, church quilts, weddings, funerals, the ordinary architecture of shared life. Margaret's mother had known every customer by name, remembered their mother's preferences, kept mental records of who was piecing quilts for new grandchildren or making curtains for remodeled kitchens. When the factories closed and customers stopped coming, Margaret faced a simple arithmetic problem. Her sales dropped by half between 1999 and 2003, then by half again. She couldn't afford to keep the lights on. Her husband, Jim, who'd worked 32 years at the glass plant before it shut down, told her gently that it was time to close, that they'd done enough, that nobody would blame her. But Margaret couldn't do it. She reduced her hours, stopped taking a salary, used retirement savings to cover rent. She kept the door open 4 days a week, then 3. Some weeks, only 2 or 3 customers came in. It didn't matter. She showed up anyway. Because Margaret understood something her husband didn't. Something you couldn't explain in financial terms. The fabric shop wasn't a business anymore. It was a place women still came to remember who they'd been before everything fell apart. It was where Linda Parsons cried the week after her son moved to Charlotte and didn't call. It was where elderly women touched bolts of calico and told stories about dresses they'd sewn for daughters now grown and gone. It was a room where the past still lived, where continuity hadn't been severed, where you could walk in and find someone who remembered your mother and your grandmother and the quilt pattern your family had used for 4 generations. Margaret kept the shop open because closing it would mean admitting that all of that, the conversation, the memory, the unbroken thread, didn't matter anymore. And she refused to admit that. Tom Radcliffe took over the 4th of July celebration in 2004, the year the town council announced there was no money left to fund it. Tom had grown up in Ripley, left for college, worked 20 years as an engineer in Columbus, and moved back in 1998 to care for his aging parents. He'd watched the parade shrink year by year, watched the crowd thin, felt the creeping sense that the tradition might simply stop. When the council made its announcement, Tom didn't wait for someone else to step in. He called the fire chief, the American Legion post commander, and the high school band director. He told them the parade would happen, that he'd pay for it himself if necessary, and that he needed their help. Tom wasn't wealthy. He lived on a modest pension and savings. But he spent his own money on permits, insurance, flags, and fireworks. He recruited volunteers to build floats, called veterans personally to invite them to march, convinced the band director to hold summer rehearsals. He printed flyers and distributed them to every mailbox in town. He worked the phone for weeks, telling people that Ripley's parade wasn't dead, that it mattered, that showing up was a choice they could still make. The 2004 parade was smaller than anyone remembered. Maybe 300 people came. The floats were simple, a trailer decorated with crepe paper, a truck carrying Boy Scouts holding flags. But it happened. The band played, veterans marched, families sat on the courthouse lawn. And when the fireworks went up that night, Tom stood in the back of the crowd and cried because he'd proven something important. That a tradition could survive on will alone, that a town could choose to remember itself even when the world had moved on. Tom organized the parade every year after that. Some years were better than others. Some years it rained and only a handful of people showed up. But it never stopped. He kept going because he believed that rituals weren't luxuries. They were how a community told itself it still existed. How people reminded each other that they hadn't been forgotten. That their lives still carried weight and meaning. Emily and Jason Corbett were 31 and 29 when they moved back to Ripley in 2006 with their 2 young daughters. Both had grown up here, left for college, built careers in Charleston. They had good jobs, a nice apartment, access to restaurants and museums, and everything a city offered. But when their oldest daughter turned 4, Emily and Jason started talking about what kind of life they wanted for their children. They remembered what it had been like growing up in Ripley. Knowing everyone on their street, walking to school alone, playing in neighbors' yards without fear, sitting on the courthouse steps eating ice cream on summer evenings. They remembered the parade, the football games, the way people showed up when someone needed help. They knew Ripley was struggling. They knew the economy was broken, that job opportunities were limited, that moving back meant financial sacrifice. Jason took a pay cut to work remotely. Emily found part-time teaching work that paid a fraction of what she'd earned in Charleston. They bought a house for less than they'd been paying in rent. An old 2-story on Walnut Street that needed work. It wasn't a practical decision. It was an emotional one. Emily and Jason wanted their daughters to grow up in a place where people still knew each other's names, where showing up mattered, where life moved slowly enough to notice things. The way light fell through trees, the sound of the high school band practicing on August evenings, the taste of tomatoes from a neighbor's garden. They wanted their children to understand that a good life wasn't measured by convenience or opportunity, but by connection and continuity and the quiet knowledge that you belonged somewhere. Other young families noticed. A few others moved back, not many. Ripley wasn't experiencing a revival, but enough to matter, enough to fill a few more pews at church, to add a few more children to the elementary school, to suggest that the town's story wasn't finished yet. Margaret, Tom, Emily, and Jason never met as a group or coordinated their efforts. They didn't think of themselves as heroes or activists. They were simply people who'd made a choice to value something other than prosperity, to protect something fragile and irreplaceable, to insist that a town's identity could survive its economy. They were the people who refused to let Ripley die quietly, who believed that memory and tradition and stubborn love were forces strong enough to hold a community together, even when every practical reason to stay had disappeared. They didn't save Ripley, but they kept its heart beating. Walk through Ripley today, and you'll see the truth without filters or false hope. 4 storefronts on Main Street remain empty, their windows soap-streaked or papered over, their awnings faded to colors that no longer have names. The hardware store building stands hollow, its interior visible through gaps in the boards. The dress shop where 3 generations of women bought Easter dresses is now a tax preparation office, open 3 months a year. The population that peaked near 4,000 in 1990 has fallen below 2,800. The high school graduating class that once numbered 120 now graduates 46. These are the facts. And the people who live here don't pretend otherwise. They know what Ripley has lost. They know it will never return to what it was. They've stopped waiting for a factory to reopen or a miracle industry to arrive and restore the prosperity their parents knew. That version of Ripley exists only in memory now, and memory, they've learned, is both comfort and weight. But walk a little farther and you'll see what the statistics don't measure. The diner on Main Street still opens at 5:30 every morning, still serves coffee to the same men who've gathered there for decades. Their numbers smaller now, but their routine unbroken. They talk about grandchildren, about the weather, about who's sick and who needs help with a roof or a ride to a doctor's appointment 2 counties over. The pharmacy still knows your name. The woman behind the counter still asks about your mother, still remembers what medicines your father took before he died. On summer Saturday mornings, the courthouse square hosts a farmer's market that draws vendors from surrounding communities. It's modest, a dozen tables offering tomatoes, green beans, zucchini, jars of honey, homemade soap, baked goods, wrapped in plastic. But people come not just to buy vegetables. They come because it's a place to see neighbors, to stand in the shade of the old trees and talk. To let children run on the grass while adults catch up on weeks of news. The market doesn't generate significant income for anyone. It exists because a few people decided it should. Because they believed Ripley needed gathering places more than it needed efficiency. The 4th of July parade still happens every year. Tom Radcliffe, now 74, still organizes it, though others have stepped in to help shoulder the cost and the labor. The parade remains small, the high school band, a handful of veterans, the fire trucks, a few decorated pickups and flatbed trailers carrying children waving flags. It rolls down Main Street under the same route it's followed for 60 years, past storefronts that will never reopen, past sidewalks where far fewer people stand to watch. But the people who do come, maybe 500 now, sometimes less, they come with intention. They're not there out of habit or boredom. They're there because the parade represents a choice, a declaration that Ripley still matters, that the town's identity isn't tied to its economy, but to the rituals its people refuse to abandon. When the veterans pass, people stand. When the band plays, parents lift children onto their shoulders. When the fire trucks sound their sirens, the noise echoes off the hills the way it always has. And for a few moments, the town feels full again. Margaret Winters finally closed her fabric shop in 2019, 34 years after her mother opened it. She held on for 2 decades past the point when it made financial sense. Long enough to see her inventory dwindle to a few shelves. Long enough to watch the women who gathered there grow old or move away or die. On her last day, a dozen women came to sit with her one final time. They didn't buy anything. There was nothing left to buy. They simply sat in the space that had held them, and they cried together. And then they locked the door. Margaret says she doesn't regret keeping it open as long as she did. The shop, she says, wasn't about fabric. It was about having a place that remembered who they used to be. Emily and Jason Corbett still live in Ripley, still raise their daughters here. Their oldest is 16 now, a junior at Ripley High School. She's applied to colleges in Charleston and Morgantown, and her parents know she'll likely leave and may not return. They've made peace with that. What matters to them is that she's grown up in a place where people know her name, where she's sung in the church choir and marched in the parade and learned that community is something you build and tend, not something that simply exists. They hope she'll carry that with her, wherever she goes. On Friday nights in the fall, the high school football team plays under lights that were installed in 1983 and repaired so many times they're held together as much by hope as by wiring. The team isn't very good. They win a few games each season, lose most of the rest. But the bleachers still fill with families, with older folks who have no children or grandchildren on the field, but come anyway because this is what you do in Ripley. You show up. You sit together. You cheer for young people who represent the town's future, however uncertain that future might be. The games are cold in November, the air sharp and smelling of wood smoke from stoves in the hills. People bring blankets and thermoses of coffee. The band plays fight songs that echo off the surrounding ridges. When the team scores, the crowd erupts. And for those few seconds, the sound fills the valley, loud and alive and defiant. It doesn't matter that the stands are half as full as they were 30 years ago. What matters is that people are still here, still cheering, still holding on. Ripley today is a town that has lost its economic foundation, but refused to lose its soul. It's smaller, quieter, older, and poorer than it once was. It will likely continue to shrink. Young people will keep leaving. More storefronts will go dark. The day may come when the parade can no longer happen, when the diner finally closes, when the last gathering place disappears and the town becomes a collection of houses with no center to hold them together. But that day hasn't come yet, and the people who remain have decided that as long as they're here, Ripley will still be Ripley. A place where the 4th of July matters, where neighbors still know your name, where tradition and memory and stubborn, quiet love are enough to keep a town's heart beating, even when everything else has gone still. Ripley's story isn't unique. Across West Virginia, across Appalachia, across the Rust Belt and the rural Midwest and the forgotten corners of the South, there are hundreds of towns like this one. Places that lost their economic reason for being, but refused to disappear entirely. Places where people chose to stay, not because it made financial sense, but because leaving would mean abandoning something they couldn't name but knew they needed. What Ripley reveals is something we've forgotten in our national conversation about struggling towns. We measure these places by metrics that can't capture what actually matters: employment rates, median income, population trends. We look at the empty storefronts and declining numbers and declare them dead or dying. But we miss what persists in the spaces between the statistics. The diner where 3 generations still gather on Sunday mornings. The parade that happens because one man decided it would. The pharmacy clerk who knows which customers live alone and checks on them during winter storms. These aren't romantic gestures. They're acts of defiance against a version of American life that says a place only matters if it's growing, only survives if it's profitable, only deserves attention if it's thriving. Ripley's people rejected that logic. They chose continuity over progress, memory over reinvention, presence over opportunity. They decided that a town is more than its economy, that it's the accumulation of generations of showing up, of knowing and being known, of maintaining traditions, not because they're easy, but because they're ours. There's a cost to that choice. The young people who leave and don't return. The businesses that close and stay closed. The slow erosion of services and options that makes daily life harder. The people of Ripley aren't blind to those costs. They live with them every day. But they've also discovered something most of America has forgotten. That community isn't something you have. It's something you build over and over through small acts of commitment that add up to a life. What do we lose when we let towns like Ripley fade from our national memory? We lose the knowledge that there are other ways to measure a meaningful life, ways that don't require constant growth or reinvention or moving wherever opportunity calls. We lose the example of people who chose belonging over ambition, who valued being part of something continuous and larger than themselves. We lose the reminder that American identity was built as much on staying as on leaving, on tending what you inherited as much as on seeking what you didn't have. Ripley, West Virginia will probably never be what it was in 1985. The factories aren't coming back. The population will likely keep declining. More storefronts will go dark. But as long as there are people who show up for the 4th of July parade, who gather at the diner on Sunday mornings, who choose to raise their children where neighbors still know their names, Ripley will survive. Not as an economic success story, but as something quieter and perhaps more important. A place where people decided that tradition, memory, and mutual recognition matter enough to fight for. That fight is also a gift to the rest of us. A reminder that we get to choose what we value, what we preserve, what we're willing to sacrifice for. Ripley's people made their choice. The question for the rest of America is whether we'll remember that such choices are still possible, and what we'll do with that knowledge. We tell stories like this because they matter. Because places like Ripley and people like Margaret and Tom and Emily and Jason are part of the American story we're in danger of forgetting. If these stories mean something to you, subscribe to stay connected. Your support helps us keep telling them.